Flight attendant rejects elderly black woman, discovers she changed the airline forever. An ordinary flight becomes extraordinary when an elderly black woman steps into the first-class cabin, her quiet dignity challenging the unspoken biases around her. A flight attendant, blinded by prejudice, denies her basic respect and service, sparking a confrontation that will leave the entire crew and the airline itself forever changed. By the end of this journey, lessons will be learned, lives will be transformed, and a legacy of compassion will take flight. What happens when prejudice meets resilience? This is a powerful story of justice, kindness, and the courage to create lasting change. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. If you enjoy stories about resilience and justice, don't forget to hit the like and share this video and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales. Your support helps us bring these impactful stories to more people. Now let's dive into this unforgettable story. The early morning air at New Orleans International Airport was thick with humidity, clinging to every surface as passengers hurried through security lines. Beyond the terminal's glass walls, the golden hues of sunrise reflected off the runway, promising another sweltering day in the south. Inside the staff lounge, Chloe Watkins stood before a full-length mirror, inspecting the crisp lines of her navy uniform. Her hair was pinned back into a perfect French twist, and not a speck of lint marred her blazer. She adjusted her name tag, polished to a gleaming shine, and gave herself a firm nod of approval. Her reflection looked every bit the image of professionalism, a trait she prided herself on. The pre-flight briefing had been routine. Safety updates, passenger manifests, and subtle exchanges between the crew that hinted at shared prejudices. Chloe dismissed them without thought. It was just how things were. As she exited the lounge, the scent of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the faint tang of jet fuel reminded her of home. Memories of her Alabama upbringing often surfaced during moments like these. She could almost hear her father's deep voice as he lectured at the dinner table, his police badge glinting under the chandelier light. "The world has rules, Chloe," he'd say, slicing into his Sunday roast, "and it's best for everyone to know their place." She remembered nodding solemnly, too young to question, too eager to please. Those words had shaped her worldview, a silent mantra guiding her interactions ever since. The first-class cabin was Chloe's domain, and she inspected it with the precision of a drill sergeant. Pillows fluffed just so, glasses aligned perfectly on their trays. She moved swiftly down the aisle, her polished shoes clicking softly against the carpeted floor. The boarding announcement crackled through the intercom, and passengers began filing. In businessmen in tailored suits, a young mother cradling an infant, and a handful of retirees clutching travel guides. Chloe greeted each with a practiced smile, her southern charm polished to perfection. And then came Diana Thompson. She moved with quiet confidence, her tailored pantsuit and leather briefcase exuding professionalism. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled into an elegant bun, and her eyes held a calm determination. "Good morning," Diana greeted with a warm smile as she handed over her boarding pass. Chloe's practiced smile faltered ever so slightly as she scanned the ticket, seat 1A, first class. Her gaze flicked up, taking in Diana's appearance once more. The briefest hesitation, a fraction of a second before she stepped aside. "This way, Mom," Chloe said, her tone clipped. Diana's polite nod was met with the weight of silent judgment. Chloe followed her movements as she settled into the plush seat, a small frown forming. Moments later, Chloe approached Diana's seat with her usual composure. "Excuse me, Mom, could I see your ticket again?" she asked, her tone professional but tinged with an unspoken question. Diana glanced up, her brow furrowing slightly. "Of course," she said, handing over the ticket once more. Chloe inspected it, as though searching for an error. "This is first class," she stated, her voice neutral yet pointed. "I'm aware," Diana replied evenly, her gaze steady. Chloe hesitated, torn between enforcing her perceived authority and the reality before her. The awkward silence drew the attention of nearby passengers. A man in seat 1C cleared his throat, casting a sidelong glance at Chloe. "Problem?" he asked, his tone sharp. "No, sir," Chloe replied quickly, handing back Diana's ticket. "Everything's fine." As Chloe walked away, she could feel the weight of eyes on her back. Jake Morrison, a sharply dressed businessman with a Rolex gleaming on his wrist, watched the interaction closely. His expression was unreadable, but his gaze lingered on Chloe for a moment too long. Further down the cabin, a young mother rocked her baby, whispering to her husband about the exchange. The air in the cabin grew heavier, the unspoken tension palpable. Back in the galley, Chloe steadied herself against the counter, her hands trembling slightly. She replayed the interaction in her mind, her father's words echoing in her ears. "And know their place," but for the first time, the mantra felt less like guidance and more like a weight. Meanwhile, Diana opened her briefcase, pulling out a notebook and pen. Her calm demeanor never wavered as she began jotting down notes, her handwriting precise and deliberate. She was no stranger to situations like this, and her years of experience had taught her that poise was often the most powerful response. Still, her eyes flicked toward the galley, her expression thoughtful. As the cabin began to settle, another passenger caught Diana's attention. Seated at the back of first class was a man in his mid-50s, his posture tense and his eyes darting nervously. Diana studied him for a moment, her professional instincts kicking in. Something about his demeanor felt familiar. "Tom," she murmured under her breath, a flicker of recognition crossing her face. Unbeknownst to Chloe, the arrival of Tom was about to intertwine their fates in ways none of them could predict. The first-class cabin hummed with a quiet rhythm as the plane leveled out at cruising altitude. Passengers adjusted their reclined seats, laptops blinked awake, and flight attendants began their service routine. Chloe Watkins moved efficiently, her practiced smile masking the slight unease lingering from her earlier interaction with Diana Thompson. Diana sat in seat 1A, engrossed in a leather-bound notebook, her pen moving with purposeful precision. Occasionally, she glanced at the aisle, her gaze drifting toward Chloe. Meanwhile, Jake Morrison, seated diagonally across in 2C, sipped his coffee, his eyes darting between Chloe and Diana as if reading unspoken words between them. Diana flipped. A page in her notebook, revealing neatly organized notes about the psychology conference she was headed to. Her phone buzzed briefly. She glanced at the screen, a reminder to prepare her keynote presentation on overcoming trauma and systemic bias. She silenced the notification and tucked the phone away, her composed exterior betraying no sign of the confrontation earlier. She had faced situations like this before, being questioned, doubted, dismissed, but years of experience had taught her to remain poised. Still, there was something about Chloe's demeanor that lingered in her mind, a trace of conflict in her otherwise polished performance. In the galley, Chloe busied herself arranging trays and organizing orders, her hands moving almost automatically. Her mind, however, wandered back to Diana's calm yet piercing gaze. The earlier tension had unsettled her, stirring memories of her father's stern lectures about maintaining authority. "She's just another passenger," Chloe muttered to herself, but the words felt hollow. When she emerged with a tray of beverages, her eyes briefly met Diana's. The older woman offered a polite smile, and Chloe quickly looked away, her stomach twisting with an unfamiliar sensation, guilt. Jake leaned back in his seat, his sharp suit unwrinkled despite the long flight. He had noticed Chloe's hesitation earlier and had watched the interaction unfold with a practiced eye. As a black man who had built his career navigating spaces dominated by implicit bias, he recognized the signs. He caught Diana's eye and nodded slightly, a silent acknowledgement. Diana returned the gesture, her expression softening for a moment before she returned to her notes. As the flight progressed, the cabin lights dimmed slightly for meal service. Chloe continued to perform her duties, but her interactions with Diana remained curt and impersonal. Passengers in first class began to notice the subtle shifts in tone, the whispered exchanges among the crew. In the back row of first class, Tom sat stiffly, his knuckles white as they gripped the armrests. His eyes darted to the windows, then back to the seat in front of him, his breathing shallow and rapid. Diana noticed the subtle signs, her professional instincts kicking in. Diana closed her notebook and set it aside, her attention drawn to Tom. His anxiety was palpable, the tension in his posture growing with each passing minute. She glanced toward Chloe, who was engaged in a quiet conversation with another attendant, seemingly unaware of Tom's state. Diana leaned forward slightly, studying the man with a mix of curiosity and concern. His face was familiar, though she couldn't place it. Suddenly, a faint tremor shook the plane as it hit a patch of turbulence. Passengers gasped, and a few clutched their armrests. Chloe's professional tone came through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing mild turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." For most, the announcement was reassuring, but for Tom, it triggered something deeper. His breathing grew more labored, and his hands trembled as he fumbled with the button on his armrest. Diana observed his reaction, her mind piecing together the signs. Hyperventilation, unfocused gaze, and beads of sweat forming on his brow as the turbulence subsided. Chloe approached Tom with a drink tray. "Sir, would you like some water?" she asked, her tone rehearsed. Tom looked up at her, his eyes wide with fear. I need to—" His voice trailed off and he clutched his chest, his breathing quickening. Chloe froze, her tray hovering. In midair, for a moment she appeared unsure of what to do, the professional mask slipping to reveal uncertainty. Diana rose from her seat, her movements calm but deliberate. "Excuse me," she said softly, placing a hand on Chloe's arm. "I'm a psychologist. I think he's having a panic attack." Chloe blinked, stepping aside as Diana knelt beside Tom. She spoke in soothing tones, her voice steady as she guided him through breathing exercises. "Focus on my voice," Diana said gently. "Inhale deeply. Now exhale. You're safe here." Tom's breathing began to slow, though his hands still trembled. Diana continued to speak calmly, her presence grounding him. As Tom's breathing steadied, he looked at Diana, his voice barely above a whisper. You know me?" Diana nodded slightly, her expression unreadable. "Yes, Tom," she said quietly. "I remember you." Chloe, standing a few steps away, felt a shiver run down her spine. There was more to this encounter than met the eye. The plane jolted as it hit another patch of turbulence, the overhead bins rattling briefly. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, some gripping their armrests a little tighter. Chloe Watkins adjusted her stance, steadying herself as she scanned. The cabin, Tom, seated at the back of the first-class cabin, seemed to shrink further into his seat. His face was pale, his eyes darting anxiously between the window and the seatbelt sign above. Diana Thompson, seated a few rows ahead, watched him intently. Her professional instincts kicked in as she noted his shallow breathing, trembling hands, and the sheen of sweat forming on his forehead. She had seen these signs before, a panic attack brewing beneath the surface. Tom's breathing grew rapid, his chest heaving as the plane rocked slightly again. The hum of the engines seemed to grow louder, triggering a cascade of memories he had tried to bury for years. 5 years earlier, aboard Flight 762, where Tom was a senior flight attendant, a seemingly routine flight had turned into a nightmare when mechanical failure led to a catastrophic crash landing. Among the casualties were Tom's wife and young daughter, who had been on board as passengers. The image of flames licking the fuselage, the screams and the deafening silence afterward haunted him still. Awards and commendations had followed the tragedy, with Tom hailed as a hero for saving dozens of passengers, yet no recognition could fill the void left by his family's loss. Unable to face the skies again, he had retired, retreating into a life of solitude. As the memories surged, Tom's breathing grew erratic. His hands gripped the armrests so tightly, his knuckles turned white. He mumbled something under his breath, incoherent words lost in the cabin's ambient noise. "Sir, are you all right?" Chloe asked, stepping closer to him. Her voice, though calm, carried an edge of uncertainty. Tom looked up at her, his gaze unfocused. I can't breathe," he stammered, his voice barely audible. Chloe froze. Her mind raced with protocol. She had memorized during training, yet the sight of his panic seemed to paralyze her. Diana rose from her seat, her movements deliberate but unhurried. "Excuse me," she said softly, placing a hand on Chloe's arm. "Let me help." Chloe hesitated, her professional authority clashing with her growing doubt. After a moment, she stepped aside, allowing Diana to kneel beside Tom. "Tom," Diana said gently, her voice steady. "Look at me. Focus on my voice." Tom's eyes flicked to her, wide and panicked. "You're safe," Diana continued. "I'm going to guide you through this. Can you take a deep breath with me?" she demonstrated, inhaling deeply and exhaling slowly. Tom mirrored her movements, albeit shakily. With each guided breath, his trembling began to subside, and the color slowly returned to his face. Chloe stood a few feet away, watching the scene unfold, her hands clenched at her sides, a mix of embarrassment and awe flooding her. Diana's calm authority and compassion contrasted starkly with Chloe's own hesitation. For the first time, Chloe felt a pang of self-doubt. Her father's teachings about control and authority had always been her guiding principles, but now they felt like a brittle mask she could no longer wear with ease. As his breathing steadied, Tom leaned back against his seat, exhausted. He looked at Diana, his eyes filled with gratitude but also recognition. I know you," he murmured. Diana's expression softened. "Yes, Tom. We've met before," she said quietly. "You probably don't remember, but I was part of the support group after the accident." Tom's eyes widened slightly. The pieces began to fall into place. Diana had been one of the counselors who had tried to help him rebuild his life after the crash. Jake Morrison. Seeing the situation, Jake approached with a bottle of water. "Here," he said, his tone calm and reassuring as he handed it to Diana. "Let me know if you need anything else." Young mother. The mother in row 3 whispered to her husband, trying to keep her young child distracted as the cabin's tension lingered. Her sympathetic glance toward Tom added a layer of communal concern. Another jolt of turbulence shook the plane, sending ripples of unease through the cabin. Tom's breathing quickened again, and his hands clutched his seatbelt. Diana acted swiftly, placing a steadying hand on his arm. "Tom, listen to me," she said firmly. "You're in control. Focus on what you can feel, the seat under you, the air moving as you breathe. You're here and you're safe." Her voice carried an authority that calmed not only Tom, but the nearby passengers as well. As Tom's panic subsided, Chloe couldn't help but ask, "How do you know all this? How do you know him?" Diana straightened, her composure unwavering. "I've spent years working with trauma survivors," she replied. Her gaze met Chloe's, steady and unyielding. "And sometimes that includes understanding how airlines handle situations like these." Chloe's brow furrowed, a flicker of confusion and curiosity passing over her face. Diana's words hinted at a depth of knowledge that Chloe hadn't anticipated, a knowledge that would soon challenge everything. She thought she knew. The turbulence outside the plane intensified, sending a ripple of unease through the cabin. Overhead, bins rattled, and the cabin lights flickered momentarily. Passengers clutched their armrests, their whispered conversations muffled by the sound of the engines. Chloe Watkins stood frozen in the aisle, her eyes darting between Tom, who was slumped in his seat, and Diana, who was already kneeling beside him. The weight of the moment pressed down on Chloe, her usual composure cracking under the strain of the unfolding crisis. "Chloe," Diana's voice cut through the tension, calm but firm. "Can you bring me a glass of water and some napkins?" The request jolted Chloe back into motion. She nodded stiffly and hurried to the galley, her thoughts racing. Diana turned back to Tom, her hands steady as she guided him through breathing exercises. "Focus on me, Tom," she said, her voice steady and reassuring. "Inhale deeply, hold it, now exhale slowly. You're doing great. Keep going." Tom's breathing, though still labored, began to slow as he followed her lead. Nearby passengers watched intently, their earlier discomfort giving way to quiet admiration. Jake Morrison leaned forward slightly, his expression one of concern and curiosity. Chloe returned with the water and napkins, setting them down on the armrest beside Diana. For a moment she hesitated, unsure of where she was needed. "Thank you," Diana said, glancing up at Chloe briefly before turning her attention back to Tom. "Stay with me, Tom. You're safe." As Tom's breathing steadied, his mind drifted involuntarily to the memories he had worked so hard to suppress. The cabin of Flight 762 had been eerily quiet, the usual hum of engines replaced by the deafening roar of fire and the distant wails of sirens. Tom had crawled through the wreckage, his uniform torn and bloodied, searching desperately for his wife and daughter. He found them near the rear of the plane, their faces pale and lifeless. The smell of smoke and burning fuel was overpowering, but it was the sight of their still forms that haunted him the most. The investigation that followed cleared him of any wrongdoing. He had done everything in his power to save lives, but no report could absolve him of the guilt he carried. Back in the present, Chloe stood a few steps away, watching Diana work with a mixture of awe and discomfort. She felt out of place, her usual confidence replaced by a nagging sense of inadequacy. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. "You need to take control, Chloe. Don't let anyone see weakness." But as she observed Diana's calm authority, Chloe began to question everything she had been taught. She thought back to a moment from her childhood, a conversation overheard between her father and a fellow officer about a case involving a black family. The dismissive tone, the casual biases, it had all seemed normal at the time, but now, standing in the presence of Diana's unwavering composure, those memories felt heavy and wrong. Jake Morrison stood and approached quietly, offering Diana a bottle of water he had taken from his seat pocket. "Here," he said, his tone low but steady. "Let me know if there's anything else I can do." Diana accepted it with a nod of thanks, her focus never leaving Tom. "You're safe, Tom," she repeated, her voice a constant anchor. A young mother in row 3 whispered to her husband, trying to keep her child distracted as the cabin's tension lingered. She glanced at Diana with a mixture of admiration and gratitude, silently acknowledging the calm she brought to the situation. The pilot's voice crackled through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing more turbulence ahead. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We're in communication with ground control, and we'll keep you updated." The announcement heightened the sense of urgency. Chloe glanced toward the galley, where another flight attendant was silently gesturing for her assistance. She hesitated for a moment before stepping away, leaving Diana to handle the situation with Tom. Tom's breathing had steadied significantly, though his hands still trembled slightly. Diana offered him the water Jake had brought, guiding him to take small sips. "You're doing great, Tom," she said, her tone warm and encouraging. As the turbulence subsided momentarily, Diana stood and addressed Chloe directly. "He'll need to rest now, but keep an eye on him. Panic attacks can be exhausting, and we should make sure he stays hydrated." Chloe nodded, her expression a mix of gratitude and humility. "Thank you," she said quietly, the words feeling foreign but necessary. Later, as Chloe moved through the cabin checking on other passengers, her mind drifted to a memory of her father. She had been 12, sitting on the porch as he spoke to a neighbor about a controversial case. "You can't trust them," he had said, his tone matter-of-fact. "They don't belong in our world." At the time, Chloe had accepted his words without question, but now she found herself questioning not only his beliefs, but her own. Tom leaned back in his seat, his eyes closed, but his breathing steady. He opened them slowly, glancing at Diana with a mix of gratitude and awe. "I don't know how to thank you," he murmured. Diana smiled gently. "You've already taken the first step by trusting me," she said. Chloe observed the exchange. From a distance, her chest tightening with an unfamiliar emotion. For the first time, she felt the weight of her own biases, and it was heavier than she had ever imagined. As the cabin began to settle, Chloe approached Diana hesitantly. "Is he going to be okay?" she asked, her voice quieter than usual. Diana nodded. "He'll be fine, but it's not just about today. Panic attacks often stem from deeper trauma." Chloe hesitated before asking, "Do you know what happened to him?" Diana's expression turned somber. "Yes, and there's more to his story than you realize." At that moment, a flight attendant approached with a message for Tom. His father's condition had worsened. Tom's eyes widened, the calm he had regained beginning to slip. The turbulence had finally subsided, and the cabin returned to an uneasy stillness. Passengers adjusted themselves in their seats, exchanging subdued whispers about the earlier chaos. Chloe Watkins moved methodically down the aisle, collecting empty cups and napkins, her mind racing with conflicting emotions. At the back of the first-class cabin, Tom sat quietly, his breathing steady, but his hands still trembling. Diana Thompson sat nearby, her notebook once again open on her lap. The calm expression on her face was a stark contrast to the weight of unspoken truths lingering in the air. "Can I get you anything else, sir?" Chloe asked Tom hesitantly, her voice softer than usual. Tom shook his head, his voice hoarse. "No, thank you." Diana glanced up, her eyes meeting Chloe's for a brief moment. There was no judgment in her gaze, only understanding, a silent invitation for Chloe to join the conversation that had yet to unfold. As the plane cruised steadily at 30,000 feet, Diana began to reflect on Tom's situation. She had seen the signs before, panic rooted in trauma too deep to heal fully. Her years working with trauma survivors had taught her that some burdens never truly disappeared. They were simply carried differently. She jotted down a few more notes in her notebook, her pen moving with quiet precision. Across the aisle, Jake Morrison observed her with a faint smile. "You always work, don't you?" he asked lightly, breaking the silence. Diana looked up, her expression softening. "When you see pain like his, you can't help but try to understand it," she replied. Chloe retreated to the galley, her thoughts swirling. Diana's calm authority during Tom's panic attack had left an impression she couldn't shake. For the first time, Chloe felt the weight of her own shortcomings, not as a professional but as a person. Her father's lessons about maintaining control, about sticking to the rules, suddenly felt hollow. The image of Diana kneeling beside Tom, speaking to him with such compassion, contrasted sharply with her father's voice in her memory. Compassion makes you weak. Chloe leaned against the counter, her hands gripping its edge. Weakness? No. Diana's strength had come from her compassion, not despite it. Back in the cabin, Tom shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He glanced at Diana, hesitating before speaking. I don't know how you remember me, he began, his voice low. After the accident, everything was a blur. Diana set down her notebook and turned toward him, her demeanor warm and approachable. I worked with a lot of survivors after the crash, she said gently. But your story, it stayed with me. Tom looked away, his jaw tightening. I didn't want to be remembered. Everyone called me a hero, but I couldn't even save my own family. The rawness in his voice hung in the air, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. Jake. Morrison leaned forward slightly, his expression somber. Jake cleared his throat, drawing both Tom and Diana's attention. I'm sorry to interrupt, he said, his tone thoughtful. But I understand what it's like to carry guilt that doesn't belong to you. Tom frowned slightly, his curiosity piqued. Jake continued, his voice steady. When I was younger, I was the first black manager at a company in Boston. Everyone looked at me like I didn't belong, like I was some kind of charity hire. One day there was an accident on the factory floor, something I had nothing to do with, but people still blame me because I was in charge. For years, I felt like I had failed, even though it wasn't my fault. He leaned back in his seat, his gaze thoughtful. It took me a long time to realize that guilt wasn't mine to carry, and neither is yours, Tom. Chloe, who had been quietly observing from a distance, took a tentative step forward. He's right, she said, her voice trembling slightly. The three turned to her, their expressions ranging from surprise to curiosity. Chloe swallowed hard, gathering her thoughts. I don't know what it's like to go through what you've been through, she admitted, addressing Tom, but I saw how strong you were today, even when you didn't feel it. Tom looked at her, his brow furrowed. I didn't feel strong, he muttered. Diana smiled faintly. Sometimes strength isn't about how you feel in the moment. It's about showing up even when it's hard. As the conversation unfolded, Chloe couldn't help but recall another memory of her father. She had been a teenager, sitting in the back of his police car during a community event. Why don't we help those people, she had asked, pointing toward a group of black families struggling to unload supplies for a food drive. Her father had scoffed. They've got their own people for that. It's not our job. At the time, Chloe had accepted his answer, but now the memory made her stomach churn. She wondered how many opportunities she had missed to be better, simply because she hadn't questioned what she had been taught. The conversation in the cabin continued, weaving stories of pain, resilience, and hope. For the first time, Chloe didn't feel the need to control it. She simply listened. As the plane hit another mild patch of turbulence, Chloe instinctively steadied herself against the seat back. Diana glanced at her, a knowing smile on her lips. You're starting to see it, aren't you? Diana said quietly. Chloe nodded, her throat tight. I think so, she replied. Just as the plane began its descent, a flight attendant approached Tom with a message from the ground crew. Mr. Harper, she said softly, her expression serious. Your father's condition has worsened. They're asking if you can come directly to the hospital after landing. Tom's face fell, and the fragile calm he had rebuilt began to crack. Diana placed a reassuring hand on his arm. We'll get you through this, she said firmly. Chloe watched the scene, her chest tightening. For the first time, she felt an urge not just to follow the rules, but to truly help. The cabin lights flickered softly as the plane began its descent into New York. The voice of the captain came through the intercom, steady but serious. Ladies and gentlemen, we've started our initial descent. We're expecting some light turbulence as we approach, so please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. Chloe Watkins moved through the cabin, her hands trembling slightly as she double-checked the passengers' seatbelts. Her earlier conversation with Diana and Tom lingered in her mind, pressing against the carefully constructed walls of her beliefs. Tom sat rigidly in his seat, his gaze fixed out the window at the clouds swirling below. The news about his father had left him quiet and withdrawn, the weight of worry etched into every line on his face. Diana sat nearby, her presence calm and steady, a quiet assurance that he wasn't alone. The turbulence began to grow stronger. As the plane entered a patch of stormy weather, passengers gasped as the aircraft shuddered, their fear palpable. Chloe gripped the edge of a seat, steadying herself as she scanned the cabin. Diana leaned toward Tom, her voice low and reassuring. "It's just turbulence. Planes are built to handle this. Focus on your breathing, just like before." Tom nodded, though his grip on the armrest tightened. Across the aisle, Jake Morrison caught Chloe's eye and offered a faint, encouraging nod. "Stay calm," Chloe muttered to herself, repeating the mantra she had clung to for years. But this time it wasn't enough to simply maintain composure. She wanted to do more, to be more. As the turbulence continued, Chloe noticed a young mother struggling to soothe her crying baby a few rows back. Without hesitation, she knelt beside the woman. "May I help?" Chloe asked, her voice softer than usual. The mother hesitated, then nodded gratefully. Chloe took the baby in her arms, rocking gently and murmuring soothing words. The babies. Cries began to quiet, and the tension in the nearby rows eased. For the first time, Chloe felt a warmth that didn't come from following protocol, but from genuinely connecting with someone in need. Meanwhile, Diana continued to guide Tom through his anxiety. She leaned closer, her voice firm yet compassionate. "Tom, you've already survived worse than this. You're stronger than you think." Tom exhaled shakily, his gaze meeting hers. I don't know if I can handle losing him too," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're not alone in this," Diana replied. "Grief doesn't have to isolate you. It can connect you to others if you let it." Tom nodded slowly, the tightness in his chest beginning to loosen. As Chloe returned the now sleeping baby to the young mother, a memory surfaced, unbidden. She was 13, sitting in the car with her father as he spoke to another officer about a community initiative to integrate local schools. "They're just pushing their agenda," her father had said dismissively. "It's not about equality, it's about control." At the time, Chloe had nodded along, eager to earn his approval. But now, as she looked at Diana, a woman who commanded respect not through control, but through understanding, she felt an ache of regret for every time she had blindly accepted her father's biases. As the plane stabilized, the tension in the cabin began to ease. Passengers who had been silent now exchanged nervous smiles, a sense of solidarity forming in the shared experience. Jake Morrison leaned toward Diana. "You have a way of keeping people grounded," he said, with a small smile. Diana chuckled softly. "Sometimes all it takes is reminding people of their own strength." Chloe overheard the exchange and hesitated before stepping closer. "I've never seen someone handle a situation like you did with Tom," she admitted, her voice tentative. Diana looked at her thoughtfully. "Compassion is a skill, just like anything else. It takes practice, but it's worth it." Chloe nodded, her gaze lowering as she processed Diana's words. At this moment, Chloe began to question everything she had believed in. Could compassion truly replace control? If you've been moved by Chloe's transformation so far, don't forget to like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories like this one. Your support helps us reach even more people with these impactful tales. Just as the plane began its final descent, the pilot's voice came over the intercom. "We're facing heavy crosswinds as we approach the runway. Please remain seated and secure all belongings." The cabin braced as the plane tilted slightly, the storm outside howling against the fuselage. Chloe noticed Tom gripping his armrests again, his breathing shallow. She hesitated for a moment, then moved toward him. "Tom," she said, kneeling beside his seat. "You've got this. You've already come so far. You're stronger than you realize." Tom's eyes met hers, his fear giving way to a faint glimmer of trust. He nodded, exhaling slowly as Chloe guided him through another breathing exercise. The plane touched down with a jolt, the wheels screeching against the wet tarmac. Passengers erupted into relieved applause, the tension in the cabin dissolving into shared gratitude. Chloe exhaled deeply, her shoulders relaxing for the first time in hours. She glanced at Diana, who offered her a small, knowing smile. As passengers began to disembark, Chloe lingered near the galley, watching Diana and Tom exchange a few quiet words. For the first time, she felt a shift within herself, a crack in the foundation of her old beliefs. The plane came to a smooth halt at the gate, but the tension lingered like the remnants of turbulence. Passengers moved to disembark, murmuring polite thanks to the crew as they passed. Chloe Watkins stood by the galley door, her hands clasped tightly together. Tom Harper was among the last to leave, his face pale but resolute. Diana Thompson walked beside him, her steady presence offering reassurance. Chloe stepped forward hesitantly. "Tom," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. He paused, his expression softening slightly. "Thank you," he said simply. It wasn't clear whether the words were meant for Chloe or Diana, but the sincerity was undeniable. At the terminal entrance, corporate representatives in crisp suits stood waiting, their expressions a mix of concern and controlled professionalism. Chloe recognized their type instantly. The airline's priority was to manage optics, not emotions. As Tom and Diana exited the plane, they were immediately met by two representatives from the airline. "Mr. Harper, Ms. Thompson, we'd like to speak with you about the events of this flight," one of them began, their tone professional but cold. Diana raised a hand gently. "Tom has urgent family matters to attend to. This conversation can wait." Her tone was calm, but there was an edge of authority that silenced further protest. Outside the terminal, reporters with cameras and microphones were already gathering, drawn by whispers of a passenger's medical emergency and turbulence drama. Tom's gaze darted toward the crowd, anxiety flickering in his eyes. Diana stepped between him and the reporters, her calm demeanor shielding him from the chaos. "We'll get you to your father," she said firmly, leading him toward a waiting car. The ride to the hospital was quiet, the hum of the car engine a stark contrast to the earlier chaos. Tom sat staring out the window, his mind clearly elsewhere. Diana sat beside him, her notebook tucked away, her focus entirely on Tom. At the hospital, Tom's family was waiting, a small group of somber faces filled with worry and grief. His younger sister approached first, her eyes red-rimmed. "He's asking for you," she said softly. Tom hesitated at the door to his father's room, his hand hovering over the handle. Diana placed a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to face this alone," she said gently. Inside, his father lay frail but conscious, his breathing shallow. Tom knelt beside the bed, tears streaming down his face as he clasped his father's hand. "I'm here," he whispered. Back at the airport, Chloe remained near the gate, her thoughts swirling. The media buzz had dissipated, but the weight of the day clung to her. She replayed every moment of the flight, the turbulence, Tom's panic attack, Diana's calm authority. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. "Control the situation, Chloe. Never let emotions take over." But now, that mantra felt hollow. She had seen firsthand the power of compassion, how Diana had guided Tom, how Jake Morrison had offered quiet support, how even passengers had united in small acts of kindness. Chloe exhaled slowly, her gaze shifting to the airline representatives who were still debriefing crew members. For the first time, she wondered if she had been so focused on following the rules that she had forgotten the purpose behind them. A manager approached Chloe, clipboard in hand. "Miss Watkins, we'll need your statement about the events of today's flight," he said briskly. Chloe nodded, her stomach tightening. She recounted the turbulence, the moment Tom had panicked, and Diana's intervention. As she spoke, she realized how much of her account centered on Diana's actions rather than her own. "What about your handling of the situation?" the manager asked, his pen hovering over the clipboard. Chloe hesitated, then spoke honestly. "I could have done more," she admitted. "I froze, but Diana stepped in and did what needed to be done." Meanwhile, passengers were also giving their accounts. Jake Morrison's testimony was particularly pointed. "Diana's actions were the reason this flight didn't spiral into chaos," he said. "She handled the situation with more care and professionalism than I've seen from most people in her position." Another passenger, the young mother from row 3, added, "She helped more than just Tom. She kept the entire cabin calm, even in the worst moments." The testimonies painted a clear picture. Diana's intervention had turned a potential disaster into a manageable crisis. At the hospital, Tom sat by his father's bedside, the minutes slipping away like sand through an hourglass. Diana remained outside the room, giving the family space but ready to offer support if needed. When Tom's father passed, it was peaceful. The quiet sobs of his family filled the room as Tom bowed his head, his hand still clutching his father's. Diana entered silently, placing a comforting hand on Tom's shoulder. "You were here when it mattered," she said softly. "That's what counts." After the passengers had cleared out and the debriefing had ended, Chloe found herself sitting alone in the terminal. She stared at the empty gate, her thoughts a jumble of regret and resolve. Diana approached quietly, sitting down beside her. "Tough day," she remarked. Chloe nodded. "I've been so focused on rules and procedures, I forgot about people," she admitted. Diana smiled faintly. "Rules are important, but they're not everything. Compassion doesn't undermine professionalism. It enhances it." Chloe looked at her, the weight of those words settling in her chest. "I want to do better," she said softly. "You've already started," Diana replied. As the two women sat in the quiet terminal, a notification pinged on Chloe's phone. The airline had sent a memo. "Pending review of in-flight events, potential adjustments to protocols will be discussed." Chloe stared at the message, her mind already turning toward the changes she wanted to make, not just in the airline, but in herself. The air in New Orleans was warmer now, tinged with the floral scents of late spring. Chloe Watkins sat on her porch, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. The city seemed alive with renewal, and for the first time in years, she felt the same within herself. She glanced at the small notebook resting on the table beside her. Inside were pages of reflections, notes from therapy, and quotes Diana Thompson had shared during their brief but impactful interactions. Chloe opened the notebook and flipped to a particular page where she had written in bold letters, "Compassion is strength." Therapy sessions. Over the past 6 months, Chloe had attended therapy sessions to unravel the tightly wound threads of her upbringing. She remembered her initial resistance, how she had walked into the therapist's office with crossed arms and guarded eyes. "I'm just here to manage stress," she had said defensively. But as the weeks passed, she began to confront the biases she had inherited from her father. Each session felt like peeling back a layer, revealing truths she had ignored for too long. Career reassessment. Chloe had also reevaluated her role as a flight attendant. She found herself volunteering for customer service workshops and even mentoring younger crew members, sharing lessons about empathy and connection she had learned from Diana. Her colleagues noticed the change. "You're different now," one of them had remarked during a recent flight. "More patient." Chloe had smiled, knowing it wasn't just patience, it was purpose. Family confrontations. The hardest moment had come 2 months ago during a heated conversation with her. "Father, you've changed," he had said, his tone laced with disapproval. "All this talk about empathy, it's weakness." "No, Dad," Chloe had replied, her voice steady but firm. "It's strength, and it's what we've been missing." Her father hadn't responded, but the silence that followed felt heavier than any argument they had ever had. Diana's community center. Meanwhile, Diana's community center had flourished. The trauma recovery program she had founded expanded its reach, helping dozens of individuals navigate their pain and rebuild their lives. Tom Harper had become one of the center's most active volunteers. His work there felt like a lifeline, a way to channel his grief into something meaningful. Every week, he led small support groups, sharing his story and listening to others with a patience he never thought he possessed. Airline policy changes. The airline had also implemented significant changes following the flight. Inspired by Diana's actions, they introduced mandatory emotional intelligence and crisis management training for all crew members. Chloe had participated in the first workshop, sharing her story with new recruits. "It's not just about following the rules," she had said. "It's about seeing people, really seeing them, and knowing how to help." Jake Morrison's mentorship. Jake Morrison had used his platform to advocate for corporate inclusivity. He launched a mentorship program for young professionals from underrepresented backgrounds, emphasizing the importance of creating spaces where everyone could thrive. Young Mother's Return. The young mother from the flight, whose child, Chloe, had visited Diana's center one afternoon. She shared how the experience had inspired her to become more active in her community, organizing local initiatives to support families in need. Crew relationships. Chloe's colleagues began to notice and emulate her new approach. The crew dynamic shifted subtly, becoming more supportive and collaborative. It was a small change, but one that Chloe knew would ripple outward. Tom Harper had found a renewed sense of purpose. While the pain of losing his father and family would never fully fade, he had learned to carry it differently. One evening, as he stood in the community center's garden, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. "It's not about forgetting," he had told Diana during a recent conversation. "It's about finding something worth moving forward for." Diana had nodded, her expression warm. "And you've found it." Chloe's transformation culminated in a public speaking event organized by the airline to announce their new policies. Standing before a room of executives, crew members, and media representatives, Chloe took a deep breath. "6 months ago, I thought professionalism meant control, following the rules no matter what, but I was wrong. Real professionalism is about connection. It's about compassion." Her voice wavered slightly as she continued, but the room remained silent, hanging on her every word. When she finished, the applause was loud and heartfelt. The event concluded with the airline's CEO announcing sweeping changes to their training programs. "We've learned from this experience," the CEO said, "and we're committed to creating an environment where empathy and excellence go hand in hand." Diana, who had been invited as a guest speaker, took the stage briefly to emphasize the importance of these changes. Her words were succinct but powerful, leaving an indelible mark on everyone present. As the event wound down, Diana received a call from a familiar voice, Jake Morrison. "We're organizing a special event to commemorate the flight," he said. "I think it's time to bring everyone back together." Diana smiled, her gaze drifting to Chloe and Tom, who were speaking quietly nearby. "Count me in," she replied. The morning sunlight filtered through the large windows of Diana's community center, casting warm golden hues across the bustling main hall. Laughter and quiet conversation filled the air as participants of a trauma recovery workshop exchanged stories over coffee. Diana Thompson stood near the entrance, watching the scene with a quiet sense of fulfillment. The program she had envisioned months ago had blossomed into something far greater, a sanctuary for healing and growth. In the adjacent training room, a group of airline trainees listened intently as a trainer discussed crisis management techniques. Chloe Watkins stood at the front, her voice steady as she guided the session. "Compassion isn't a soft skill," Chloe said, her gaze moving across the room. "It's the foundation of professionalism. When you treat people with understanding, you make everything stronger, your team, your passengers, and yourself." The trainees nodded, scribbling notes, and Chloe felt a flicker of pride. New airline training implementation. Diana had partnered with the airline to design a curriculum that combined emotional intelligence training with real-life crisis scenarios. Her sessions were in high demand, and the impact was already evident. Community outreach growth. The center had expanded its reach, offering workshops for families, first responders, and survivors of various traumas. Testimonials from participants painted a picture of hope restored and lives rebuilt. One young man, who had lost his sister in an accident, approached Diana after a session. "I don't think I'd be here if it weren't for this program," he said, his voice trembling. Diana placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're stronger than you think," she replied. Tom Harper had found purpose again. While his grief lingered, it no longer consumed him. He had begun consulting with the airline, using his experience to advise on safety protocols and passenger care. One day, during a small group session at the community center, Tom shared a piece of his story. "For years, I let guilt define me," he admitted. "But being here, sharing this space with all of you, has taught me that our stories don't have to end with pain. We can rewrite them." The group nodded in quiet agreement, their eyes reflecting the strength they drew from his words. Chloe's transformation had continued to unfold. She was now a certified trainer for the airline's emotional intelligence program, blending her newfound understanding with practical applications for crew members. During one session, a trainee asked, "What made you change?" Chloe paused, considering her words. "I saw what happens when we lose sight of the people behind the uniforms, the tickets and the rules," she said, "and I didn't want to be that person anymore." Her honesty resonated deeply, and several crew members approached her afterward to thank her for sharing. Jake Morrison. Jake had launched a foundation promoting inclusivity in corporate environments with a focus on mentoring young professionals. His success story was featured in a prominent business journal, inspiring others to follow his lead. Young Mother. The young mother from the flight had started a local initiative to support single parents, inspired by the compassion she witnessed. During the flight, she visited Diana's center to thank her personally. Crew relationships. Chloe's former crew members acknowledged her growth, creating a ripple effect of empathy and understanding within the team. At a formal event held at Diana's center, the airline announced its new training program as the industry standard. The CEO stepped onto the stage, commending Diana, Tom, and Chloe for their roles in inspiring the changes. "These policies are about more than just training," the CEO said. "They're about creating a culture where compassion is valued as highly as professionalism." The highlight of the event was the award ceremony, where Diana, Tom, and Chloe were honored for their contributions. Tom's speech was brief but heartfelt. "This journey has been one of pain, healing, and growth," he said, "but the most important thing I've learned is that we're never truly alone." Chloe's turn came next. She stood at the podium, her hands steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. I used to think strength came from control, she began. But the people I've met, Diana, Tom, and so many others, have shown me that true strength comes from connection. And that's a lesson I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. The applause that followed was thunderous. Among the crowd, Chloe spotted her father sitting quietly, his expression thoughtful. After the ceremony, Diana received a call from Jake. "We're organizing a commemorative flight," he said. "It's a chance to bring everyone back together and reflect on how far we've come." Diana glanced across the room, where Chloe and Tom were deep in conversation. A smile spread across her face. "Count me in," she replied, as she ended. The call, Diana reflected on the journey that had brought them all here. The flight had been turbulent in more ways than one, but it had also been transformative. And as she looked at the people around her, she felt certain of one thing: the best. Journeys are the ones that change us. The engines hummed softly as the plane ascended into the clear morning sky, the cabin brimming with quiet anticipation. The one-year commemorative flight had brought together passengers, crew, and supporters from all walks of life. This journey wasn't just about retracing the steps of Flight 2467. It was about honoring the growth, healing, and connections it had inspired. Diana Thompson, seated by the window, gazed out at the endless horizon. Beside her, Tom Harper adjusted his tie, nervously, the framed photograph of his father resting on his lap. Chloe Watkins moved through the aisle with an ease that belied her once turbulent confidence. The cabin was alive with familiar faces. Jake Morrison offered a warm handshake to the young mother from row 3, whose daughter waved shyly at Chloe. Former crew members greeted one another, their camaraderie tinged with the nostalgia of shared experience. The captain's voice came over the intercom, steady and reverent. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us on this special flight. Today, we remember the events of a year ago and the remarkable resilience that grew from them. We also honor the memory of those we've lost." Tom stood at the front of the cabin, holding the photograph of his father close to his chest. His voice trembled as he began to speak. "My father believed in showing up, even when it was hard," he said, his gaze sweeping the room. "He taught me that life isn't about avoiding turbulence, it's about how we face it. This past year, I've learned that none of us face it alone." He paused, his voice breaking. Diana stepped forward, placing a steadying hand on his shoulder. Tom took a breath, and when he spoke again, his words were stronger. "I'm here today because of the kindness and strength of the people on this flight. Thank you for helping me find my way back." The cabin erupted in soft applause, many passengers dabbing at their eyes. Chloe, standing at the back, felt tears. You prick her own. The celebration continued after the flight landed in New Orleans, moving to Diana's now thriving community center. The once modest space had transformed into a bustling hub of activity, its walls lined with photographs and testimonials from those whose lives it had touched. In the main hall, Jake Morrison addressed the gathered crowd. "This center is more than a building. It's a movement," he said, his voice rich with conviction. "It's proof that compassion is a force that can change not just lives, but systems." Diana stood nearby, her heart swelling with pride as she watched her vision unfold. Across the room, Chloe exchanged a smile with the young mother, who now led a local initiative supporting single parents. Tom, meanwhile, greeted new volunteers, his presence a quiet testament to the power of healing and resilience. When Chloe took the stage, the room fell silent. She clutched the edges of the podium, her knuckles white, but her voice, when it came, was steady. "A year ago, I thought strength came from control," she began, "from sticking to the rules, from keeping emotions at bay. But I was wrong. Strength comes from connection, from seeing people for who they are and standing beside them when they need it most. She paused, her gaze sweeping the room until it landed on her father, sitting quietly in the back. For a brief moment, their eyes met. I learned that lesson from the people on this flight, from Diana, from Tom, Chloe continued. And it's a lesson I carry with me every day. The applause that followed was thunderous, but it was the small, hesitant nod from her father that brought tears to Chloe's eyes. Later, as the gathering wound down, Tom found himself in the center's garden. The quiet hum of the celebration filtered through the open windows, blending with the soft rustle of leaves. Diana joined him, her presence as steady as ever. "You've come a long way," she said. Tom nodded, his fingers tracing the frame of his father's photograph. "I used to think grief was something you carried alone," he said. "But being here, seeing how far we've all come, I finally understand that healing isn't about forgetting. It's about finding a way to honor what we've lost by moving forward." Inside the hall, the airline's CEO took the stage to deliver a monumental announcement. "Today we're proud to declare that the training program inspired by the events of Flight 2467 will become a permanent fixture, not just at our airline but across the industry," he said. "This program is a testament to the power of compassion and the importance of prioritizing humanity in everything we do." The room erupted in applause. Diana, Chloe, and Tom stood together, their shared journey a quiet but powerful affirmation of the changes now set in motion. As the event drew to a close, Jake approached Diana with a mischievous grin. "We're planning something special," he said. "The airline is organizing a commemorative flight to honor everything this journey has accomplished. It's called the Flight of Compassion. And you, Chloe, and Tom, you're our guests of honor." Diana laughed softly. "Count us in," she replied, her gaze drifting to Chloe and Tom. The three stood together in the fading light of the garden, their laughter mingling with the warm breeze. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if that flight had been just another ordinary day?" Chloe asked, her voice thoughtful. Diana smiled. "Ordinary days are the ones that build extraordinary lives. Every small action we take matters, and this—" she gestured to the bustling center, to the people whose lives they'd touched, "is proof of that." As the sun dipped below the horizon, their silhouettes stood framed against the golden light, a quiet but enduring symbol of hope, growth, and the enduring power of connection. Diana stood in the garden, the sunlight casting a golden glow over the community center that had become a beacon of hope for so many. As she watched Chloe and Tom share a quiet laugh, she smiled, knowing their journey, like hers, was far from over. This wasn't just an end to a chapter, it was the beginning of a greater legacy. Together, they had proven that compassion and connection could dismantle prejudice and create lasting change. Diana Thompson's story reminds us all that transformation starts with small but courageous acts of kindness. What would you do if faced with a moment of prejudice or injustice? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful, meaningful stories. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next journey of hope and change.